Hello everyone, I'm honored to be a part of Upstream 2022. My name is Christine Abernathy. I lead the open source program office at F5. F5 builds products and services to make sure that apps are fast, available, and secure across any on-premise and multi-cloud environment. In this talk, I'll be sharing ideas around how you can plan exit strategies for your open source projects. This talk is primarily for project maintainers and for those managing project portfolios. Hopefully, you'll get some good ideas on how to best plan for the outcome you want to see in your open source project. Back in the day, when I started a company with some friends, we mistakenly thought that we were going to spend much of our time on a golf course, and there was probably a vision of a beach somewhere in there. It ended up being quite a bit of hard work, but I did learn a thing or two about startup businesses and how you can create a business plan. Additionally, I did spend time on 2 different open source program offices. I've seen how there are certain similarities around open source projects and how one manages a business. So when you're thinking about planning your open source project, it might help to think about it as if you're planning a business. Some of the questions you might ask yourself include: what is your unique value proposition? Who is your customer? Who can you partner with to deliver on your project goals? What project outcomes are you looking for? What does success look like? As the title of this talk says, what is your exit strategy? What is your end game? Maybe your end game as a business is to go IPO. Perhaps it's to sell your business to another one or merge with another business. Sometimes it's time to just basically say goodbye and walk out the door. And though there might be some similarities within open source projects and businesses, it's not always true, but you know what? We're gonna take our best guess at it. So as part of this, the focus on this talk is on exit strategies, but we're gonna be talking about other things as well. So let's walk through some example scenarios as we play a game that we will loosely call, what would you do next? So, in these different scenarios, what would you do if you're an independent developer who's hacked on a really cool idea? You've gained some good traction in the community. You've seen promising growth, and now you're looking at sustaining what you've built. What would you do? Scenario 2, what would you do if you're a startup built around an open source technology? You're struggling to find a way to make money on your venture. What are your options? What would you do if you're a company that's looking to disrupt the industry? Maybe you want to transform your business or start a new line of business by pushing a certain piece of technology through open source. Or maybe you are a company that there is some emerging tech that you want to accelerate, and you realize that the best way to do that is to standardize on some certain tech. But how would you go around doing this? What would you do if you're part of the open source program office like I am and you want to manage major transition in one or more projects? Maybe the project is no longer being actively maintained, or maybe the project maintainers are no longer there. They've left the company, they're disinterested. Maybe they've left the company and they want to work at it from their new company, but it's complicated. Or maybe they formed a new company around it and the community is confused about where to go for support and who is the canonical place to look for actual code. What would you do in these scenarios? Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list of endgame scenarios or transitional scenarios, if we're going to say this correctly. But this should give you an idea of the types of things that you should be concerned about, and then use it to apply it to your own unique set of circumstances. Let's start with the first scenario. You're an indie developer. You want to figure out what are the next steps in taking your hobby and perhaps turning it into a serious venture, perhaps a startup. So, what should you be thinking about here? The key in whether it's this scenario or the other scenarios is, as a baseline, is to take care of your growing community of not just users, but of contributors. We're going to be exploring different business models in some of the future scenarios as we walk through what might be right for you. But this is something that you're going to be considering. But let's walk through an example scenario to see how this could potentially play out as this is successful. The example we're going to look at is Excalibur. So, Excalibur, this is a project that was started by a procrastinating manager at Meta called name of Visual. So Visual was procrastinating. He was trying to do performance review, or he should have been doing performance review, but instead he was trying to figure out how to actually naturally draw these different doodles. He put his progress report on Twitter and found a few folks who were interested in seeing what he was working on. So he very quickly put the project on GitHub. He grabbed all of the relevant social media handles, and then he put together a list for those who were interested in working with him to get together and do so. Everybody who pulled in a pull request that was accepted, he basically gave committer access, which was not abused. Within a couple of weeks, he saw some strong user and contributor community around that. Within the next couple of years, he was able to build this up to the point where it was really a thriving community. There was interest from enterprises, but they wanted certain features, and they also wanted a guarantee of a certain kind of support. They started thinking about, they being the people who were working on it at that time, could they really do this continuing as a band of volunteers? How could they potentially sustain it? What they then decided to do is they created Excalibur Plus. A group of those volunteers ended up creating a company around it, and they then, not just taking sponsorship, but through a software as a service like a SaaS model, they had monthly subscription, of which they then gave access to enterprise type features such as collaboration, which tends to be important in enterprise settings, as well as some extra security features, the ability to have end-to-end encryption. And this is the way that this company went from a hobby to an actual startup. The next example, the next logical end, is the scenario for an open source startup. What should you be doing as a business model that's right for you? And what are some of the exit strategies that make sense for you? Because this is more like a business, you'd be thinking about questions like, should you be going it alone? Should it be an IPO? Acquisitions are also viable options. So as you're thinking through this, let's talk about some business models. Let's start with GitLab. GitLab.com, it's a place where you can actually have CI/CD pipeline, sort of like GitHub. There's an open source version which you can take for free and run it locally. You can also use GitLab.com for free, but they do hold back some proprietary features that they then make available for a monthly charge. So this is what's called an open core business model, where there's certain features which are completely free, and then some extra proprietary features typically for enterprises that you have to pay for. GitHub had tried many different business models, and they found that this is the one that worked out really well for them. The thing that you should always be mindful of if you're actually exploring this business model is the question of what would prevent somebody from actually taking what you have that's open source, forking it, and actually creating a business model out of that. Well, it's a question of how well are you taking care of your community. Additionally, people tend to trust the people who originally wrote the code. So that's something that is in your favor if that is who you are. But this is something that you have to keep in mind. GitLab also does a really good job about being very open and transparent about how they actually take in features. For example, if somebody makes a pull request that is a feature that they are working on or is in their roadmap for the enterprise features that are paid for, they will think around how they can actually address that. This has actually worked pretty well for them. We talked about different business model. Another business model that works pretty successful that Red Hat employed early on was around paid support that's built around an open source project. So this is what Red Hat did with Linux. So you, as an enterprise customer who typically wants extra support, you would then pay them. The open source software is completely free, but you pay for the support around it. And another business model that is actually working pretty well, similar as Databricks. It's actually one of the more recent companies. Databricks is an analytics cloud platform, allowing you to store enormous amount of data that can be processed and run smoothly. It's built on top of a popular open source project, which is called Apache Spark. Now, Databricks started offering enterprise tools in 2017, and its revenue grew to $200 million in 2019. It was valued at $38 billion in late 2021. The way Databricks makes money is clients pay hourly to use their platform. Users can also subscribe to Databricks premium services, and then they're able to use their resources whenever they want to. So open source companies are doing really well, and this is evidenced by some of the acquisitions that have happened in the recent past. In 2019, Red Hat was acquired by IBM as part of what was then the largest software deal in history for $34 billion. A press release stated that Red Hat bought IBM for this really extensive open source technology portfolio. They then got access to innovation in terms of the hybrid cloud platform and a really vast array of open source developer community. At F5, where I work, F5 purchased Nginx in 2019 for around $670 million. And Nginx is an open source leader in application delivery and was able to expand F5's multi-cloud application services across all environments. Microsoft was another big acquisition of an open source company, GitHub. In 2019, they bought GitHub for $7.5 billion. And according to their press release, the deal, which basically heightened Microsoft's developer focus, and it kind of like drove this more into open source development. And it's going to bring in these enterprise level use of GitHub, and then also bring Microsoft's developer tools and services to new audiences, basically the open source world. So you can see that all this happened in 2019, and you're seeing that these open source companies are actually exiting to really good exits around acquisitions. Let's look at one more scenario. In this scenario, what would you do if you're a company looking to disrupt the industry and to build a coalition to standardize tech? Just like in the other scenarios, expanding adoption in the user and the contributor base is key. Additionally, when you're architecting your solution to grow the ecosystem, it really helps to make it in such a way that it is extensible. In this particular scenario, because you're trying to build a coalition and to standardize, you want to start off in a vendor-neutral space as fast as possible or get there really quickly. And typically the best way to do that is in foundations, which if set up correctly, tend to be vendor-neutral. So we're going to go through a few stories starting where this actually worked out pretty well. Let's start with Kubernetes. Docker makes containers really easy to use, and containers enables developers to package applications that can run locally, in data centers, and in the cloud. Kubernetes came along to make it really easy to manage these containers. And the backstory, if you go to this really good documentary called Kubernetes, the documentary, Google was playing catch up to Amazon Web Services cloud offerings. And Kubernetes was providing that inroad, at least that's what they thought. I really like this quote from Joe Beder. He's the co-creator of Kubernetes. He said that building a community via open source was going to be our best way to establish a de facto standard. So when Kubernetes was launched in 2014, there were already other container orchestration offerings that were there or that were even launched that very same day. Some of this included Docker Swarm, Mesos. Now Mesos was more mature and it was actually production grade. It had been around for a few years before that. In fact, when some companies were trying to figure out whether they should adopt Kubernetes or Mesos, Netflix, Airbnb, and Apple, they all chose Mesos because it was just able to work at production scale. So what Google then realized that if they wanted the technology to be ubiquitous and used by everyone, then it needed to be held under open governance. And when we're thinking about open governance, we're thinking about governance is who gets to make a decision in terms of what is the technical direction of the project, who gets to have the final say so in what gets committed, who has influence on the roadmap. So if something is being governed and open and it's in a neutral space, then you have a lot of voices that are actually playing into that decision making, and it's not under the control of one company. Obviously, when Kubernetes was first launched, it was under the control of Google, but they realized that they needed to basically expand that base. So in 2015, when Kubernetes 1.0 was released, at the same time, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation was formed under the Linux Foundation. The charter of the CNCF was basically to take Kubernetes and adjacent technologies and to harmonize them in advance of the cloud-native computing and make that available for everybody. The launch partners included Box, Cisco, as well as previous competitors Mesosphere and Docker. And in the end, the key to Kubernetes winning, because there was Mesosphere and there's Docker Swarm, there were other incumbents, different technical philosophies, very opinionated, but Kubernetes was able to win because it had, as the documentary says, a vast army of contributors that came along for the ride along the way. Additionally, they were able to gather together this broad array of industry players who basically put the stamp of approval on them. That speaks to the power of vendor neutrality and in a foundation space. Another example is the Open Neural Network Exchange, or ONNX. It's an open format to build, format built to represent machine learning models. It allows AI engineers to more easily move models between frameworks. Like, for example, a framework could be PyTorch, another is TensorFlow. Currently, it's a graduate level project in the Linux Foundation's AI Foundation. And ONNX, as a backstory, was originally developed and open sourced by Microsoft and Facebook in 2017. And ever since then, through coalition building, it's become somewhat of a standard. We have companies like AWS, HP, IBM, NVIDIA, and Qualcomm. They're all companies that are supporting it. Here at F5, a recent project where we're trying to build like the coalition is called the Open Programmable Infrastructure Project, or the OPI project. It's still in the early stages of forming. Partners include Red Hat, Intel, and F5. The OPI project grew out of the need for a community agnostic set of APIs to make infrastructure fully programmable across software and hardware devices. And this was going to be able to advance and make all of the different players move just that much faster. So again, foundations are a key way if you want to build neutrality and standardize on tech. Let's talk about our last scenario. So what would you do if you're an OSPO, an open source program office, for example, trying to manage all of these different project life cycles? Some of the different life cycles could go from like incubating, which is where the project might be nice and early and trying to figure out where to grow next, to maybe goes to a part where it's actively being maintained, but at some point it might get the maintenance might kind of like drop off. What would you do in all of these different scenarios? Well, I think the overarching picture is to make it really clear to the community what's happening in terms of these different projects. For example, if the project is stable, you want to make it really clear that you're only probably going to be working on security patches and nothing more. Be very clear in your docs. If the project is no longer maintained, make sure that you may archive the project or give an indication to the community in some way that you are no longer going to be supporting it. If there is another community member or another company that's willing to take on the project and the community has the appetite for it, definitely see if there's a way that you can do that. You know, projects can always fork your project and become the de facto canonical where people in the community go look for it. But if you gave them that stamp of approval, that really helps. One of the projects at Facebook/Meta that we worked on was Async DisplayKit. It was like an iOS library. A core maintainer left, went to Pinterest. After a lot of different decision making, we decided to archive the project and that point people to that new community. For different complications around IP, we were not really able to transfer the project over to them, which would have transferred everything, including the watches, etc. But they were able to basically regrow the community. Another thing that can actually get a little crazy is like sometimes if you have like somebody who leaves the company and goes work to a new company, it might make sense to actually put that in a foundation so that everyone can work together in a vendor neutral place. Because sometimes competitors don't want to like contribute to another competitor's code base, but if it's in a foundation, they're a lot more amenable to doing that. So for example, GraphQL was donated to, actually created its own little foundation under the Linux Foundation. But you know, always be beware of all these different splits in the communities that can happen, especially when some of like the key team members leave and go to the different communities. PrestoDB was that one example of that. So we've talked about foundations and touched on a little bit here and there. So I want to dive into this question of foundations. What should you be thinking about as you're donating to a foundation? These are some of the questions that you might be asking yourself. Should I go to an existing foundation, or should I actually create a new one? Why would you create a new one? You could potentially create a new one if there is no existing foundation that actually fits what you want to do. But there are so many foundations out there that you probably want to take a look at that first. Usually foundations are non-profit organizations. They do a lot of things that allow you to grow your project. They usually have services around, say, marketing, legal services, and they just have like a way of just organizing all of these different, potentially sometimes competitive entities. Another question that you want to ask yourself in a foundation is, how much is it going to cost you? Different foundations cost a different amount. Sometimes to become a member or to have a project in that foundation, you might have to be at a certain tier level of contribution. Sometimes every other founding member, if you have founding members, might need to pay a certain amount to join. It's like a pay as you play. So cost is definitely a consideration when you're thinking about like the pros and cons. You also might be thinking about like the governance needs. What are the government requirements that an existing foundation already has? And also, what are the governance requirements that you would like to see? Perhaps in the beginning, you might want little bit more control as you get more community adoption and grow that aspect of it. So how can you basically seed the governance the way you like it to be? But generally, the way to do it is that over time, you want to make it as vendor neutral as possible to actually meet the needs of growing that project. Another question that you might be asking is, as you are actually evaluating which foundation to go with, is this the right foundation? Are the users there? Are the developers there? If you're doing things with Cloud Native, you might consider going to the Cloud Native Foundation. If you're doing some project around infrastructure, you might think about like the Open Infrastructure Foundation. There are different pros and cons, and definitely have conversation with all of those different groups to find out which works for you. As I said, there are many different foundations out there. These are two of the biggest ones. The Apache Foundation, as an example, they have basically a meritocratic system. So there are different committees that control and drive the development of some of the several software projects. The board oversees the whole process. You also have another one is Linux Foundation. They have a little bit more of a flexible approach. So basically, the Linux Foundation serves as an umbrella for its different projects. Different projects can deploy specific development processes. They might have their own different types of governance that they decide. But say you go into the CNCF, then you're going to be subject to sort of like the governance that they have. And if something doesn't work for you, you can talk with the Linux Foundation and they might be able to work out something for you. The Linux Foundation in general, they concentrate more on promoting the benefits of open source. So their structure is a little different. And as I said, there's lots of different foundations out there that you can look at. As you think about donating to foundation, these are some of the things that you need to keep in mind. As an example is, what is your project name? If your project name has, say, your company business as part of it, that might be like a little tricky, especially if you're just donating that project. And alongside that, when you're donating the IP, because when you're actually donating to a foundation, you're donating the IP, you're also typically, the foundation is going to want the trademarks as well. So that's something to think about. Licensing, is your license that you have in the project right now compatible with what are the licensing that are the projects in that foundation? If it's a permissive license that you have, you don't want to go somewhere where it needs to be GPL or something else that might kind of like conflict with it. So be careful and think about that. And this applies to whether or not you're moving it to a foundation or transferring it to a different entity that might be relicensing. Another thing is like some projects require contributors to sign a contributor license agreement to give them a license to actually use the project, but it might go to a different entity that may not have a contributor license or may have a different contributor license. So what do you do for all of the contributors who have already participated in the project thus far? These are things that you need to be mindful and thinking about. So as we conclude this talk, I just want to leave you with a couple of pro tips. In general, whether you're working on all of these different exit strategies and your business plan, you want to think about how you grow adoption in the user and contributor base, because that's going to like feed into what successful outcome you have. Governance is really important. You want to make sure that it is transparent and it is open, that it's very clear for people how they can actually go from one level to the other. And there are different structures that make that really easy to set up, especially if you do things in our foundation. When you're working with foundations or in general, you want to see about cultivating industry partnerships, because it's these strong foundations that's going to make it a lot more easier to kind of graduate into all of these different like next level or next transition point. And finally, always have a plan B, especially if you're working in an open source program office, because projects come and go through various different states. And you may want to be thinking about what happens when my core maintainer leaves. What happens when I want to kind of like work with competitors, with my frenemies, etc. There's always a plan B and a contingency plan. So just knowing all of the different transition and exit plans is going to be like a really useful tools that you can have and put in your back pocket for all of the different scenarios that can come up. I really enjoyed getting a chance to share some of these things that I've learned with you. I hope you have a good rest of the conference. Thank you so much.